In 1912, the RMS Titanic sailed as the largest moving object humans had ever built. It carried the confidence of an empire, the wealth of the elite, and the fragile hopes of migrants. Days later, it lay at the bottom of the North Atlantic with more than 1,500 dead. The official story said it was an accident caused by an iceberg, human error, and bad luck. Yet for more than a century, questions have remained. Evidence has surfaced, motives have been examined, theories have multiplied. Some argue the sinking was not fate, it was a plan that served the powerful. To understand any alleged conspiracy, the story must begin before the voyage itself. The Titanic belonged to the White Star Line, controlled financially by American banker John Pierpont Morgan. He was one of the richest and most influential people in the world. His banking empire shaped railroads, steel, shipping, and the U.S. financial system. When Morgan backed the creation of the Olympic-class ships, the project became a symbol of industrial dominance. The plan included 3 vessels, the Olympic, the Titanic, and later the Britannic. Their mission was not speed but luxury. They would attract wealthy passengers and secure market control for White Star Line. The first ship, RMS Olympic, launched in 1911. It sailed under the command of Captain Edward Smith. The Olympic quickly had problems. In September 1911, it collided with the British warship HMS Hawke near Southampton. The impact damaged both ships. Investigations found the Olympic partially at fault. The White Star Line faced expensive repairs and insurance disputes. Some analysts claim that the Olympic never fully recovered structurally. It allegedly developed a permanent list and stress damage on its hull. The repairs drained company finances just when Titanic was meant to secure their future. Here is where the first conspiracy hypothesis takes shape. According to this theory, the Olympic and Titanic were nearly identical. They shared dimensions, designs, and equipment. Only subtle differences separated them: window positions, floor layouts, and interior decor. The claim states that the White Star Line, under financial pressure, secretly swapped the ships. The damaged Olympic, unable to gain full insurance coverage, would deliberately be sacrificed at sea in a controlled disaster. The insurance money would save the company. The pristine Titanic would continue service under the name Olympic. If the plan succeeded, the public would see a tragic accident instead of corporate fraud. Supporters of the ship swap theory point to several observations. They note that some porthole numbers and placements seen in Titanic photographs match earlier images of Olympic. They also highlight interior changes made to Titanic shortly before sailing, which they argue were attempts to disguise the switch. Some crew members reportedly recognized differences and made remarks suggesting they were not on the ship they expected. These hints are not proof, but they fueled suspicion. Another element involves finance. J.P. Morgan held personal control over the International Mercantile Marine Company, the parent of White Star Line. If a single ship failed, his empire could absorb the damage. But if the Olympic state caused a catastrophic legal loss, even Morgan might struggle. A deliberate sinking, carefully planned, could eliminate the liability. Insurance would cover what lawsuits might destroy. However, if the disaster was planned, why choose a passenger voyage? That question brings in more layers. One argument suggests that involving civilians would create legitimacy. A ship carrying only cargo or a skeleton crew might raise doubts. The presence of prominent figures and everyday travelers would make the event appear truly accidental. Another assertion is darker. Some believe the voyage was not only about insurance, but also about eliminating individuals who opposed Morgan's interests. On board Titanic were several wealthy businessmen linked to opposition against the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve banking system. The most famous names include John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus. They were among the richest men of their era. Some historians argue that they supported financial policies that threatened Morgan's dominance. Their deaths in this narrative removed obstacles to the central banking reforms Morgan favored. 1 year later, the Federal Reserve Act passed. Morgan's influence grew. Critics connect the two events as cause and effect. Mainstream historians reject this link, but the timing remains suspicious to those who study power networks. The conspiracy theories gained momentum from behavior soon before the sailing date. J.P. Morgan had reserved one of the best suites. He was widely expected to join the maiden voyage. But just before departure, he canceled his trip. His stated reason referenced health and business concerns. Meanwhile, several other high-profile industrialists also withdrew. Opponents of the theory see this as coincidence. Supporters see a warning. There were odd maneuvers on the deck before Titanic left port. The vessel nearly collided with the liner SS New York due to suction from its massive propellers. Some interpret this as more evidence of steering issues inherited from the Olympic. Others see it as routine maritime risk. But in conspiracy study, small irregularities are rarely ignored. Titanic then proceeded into the Atlantic with more than 2,200 people aboard. Luxury dominated the upper decks. Immigrant families filled the lower cabins. The ship's wireless calmness and steel-plated pride reinforced belief in its invincibility. Captain Edward Smith, nearing retirement, carried a reputation of professionalism. Yet some reports suggest he was under pressure to maintain high speed to impress the world and secure headlines. Whether from corporate objectives or personal ambition, Titanic pushed forward despite iceberg warnings. The night of April 14, 1912, brought clear skies and calm waters. That tranquility hid danger. Icebergs drifted unusually far south that year. Merchant ships in the area sent multiple warnings. The wireless operators on Titanic acknowledged them, but continued handling personal passenger messages. The ship kept speed. Some scholars say Smith trusted Titanic's strength. Others accuse corporate oversight demanding fast arrival. When the lookout Frederick Fleet spotted the iceberg, the reaction was immediate but insufficient. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side, puncturing multiple compartments. Titanic was designed to survive flooding in up to 4 compartments. 6 were breached. The situation turned fatal. Here, the conspiracy lens asks critical questions. Why did Titanic strike the iceberg head-on with its vulnerable side instead of glancing off with the stern? Some claim the Olympic had structural weaknesses in that same area, implying the accident matched a known flaw. They argue that a controlled collision was planned but miscalculated, causing more destruction than intended. This idea lacks direct evidence, but it continues to circulate. There were also delays in launching lifeboats. Officers launched boats half empty. Evacuation rules prioritized women and children first, but lacked systemization. The ship carried far too few lifeboats for everyone on board. This was not illegal, but it was known negligence. White Star Line had chosen aesthetics and passenger space over safety. That decision made the death toll catastrophic. If the sinking was orchestrated, these deficiencies would guarantee a large and tragic result. Radio communication adds another disputed layer. The wireless distress system was new technology. Titanic's calls were heard by several ships, but the nearest major vessel, SS Californian, did not respond in time. Reports suggest the Californian's crew saw distress rockets but failed to act. Their radio operator had gone off duty. The captain did not interpret the signals as emergency calls. This negligence was later criticized, but conspiracy theorists argue it was intentional. They propose the Californian was positioned as a rescue vessel if the plan proceeded smoothly at a slower rate. When the damage became greater than expected, the window for rescue closed. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan's public response to the disaster was minimal. He sent condolences. He offered financial support. But he never fully explained his sudden cancellation or his knowledge of the ship's conditions. Investigators in the United States and Britain held inquiries. They blamed Captain Smith and iceberg warnings. They criticized radio protocols and lifeboat policies. They did not mention insurance motivations or industrial power struggles. Testimonies were inconsistent. Crew members were pressured to follow official narratives. The White Star Line sought to preserve reputation and investor confidence. In the aftermath, rumors became fertile ground. One of the most striking points in conspiracy circles is the behavior of officers and financiers after the sinking. J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of White Star Line, survived the disaster by stepping into a lifeboat. His decision was heavily condemned. Some argue he knew too much to die. Others see only cowardice. Still, his survival kept him available to shape the official story. The wreck itself adds another dimension. When Robert Ballard discovered Titanic in 1985, the brake pattern and hull damage surprised experts. The ship had split into two large sections with scattered debris fields. Some analysts claimed this was consistent with metal fatigue caused by earlier damage. They looked again at the Olympic collision. They compared metallurgy samples and rivet failures. Questions resurfaced about whether the vessel underwater was truly Titanic or the altered Olympic. Photographs of structural differences remained debated. Without complete documentation of modifications made during construction and repair, certainty remains elusive. Historians favor simpler explanations. They cite the arrogance of the age. Industrial leaders trusted technology more than caution. Safety was secondary to prestige. The sinking was a tragedy of human overconfidence. But conspiracy researchers argue that power rarely wastes opportunities. They look at Morgan's gains. They point to the absence of several wealthy critics of his policies. They note that the insurance payout did not recover all losses, but it protected the company from collapse. They question how chance aligned so neatly with the interests of the elite. There is also the controversial role of the press. Newspapers sensationalized the disaster, but rarely questioned the motives of those at the top. Morgan owned significant influence in media. Those who attempted deeper investigations found little cooperation. Records disappeared. Witnesses died. Rumors lived. As the iceberg narrative settled into history books, alternative theories remained alive in whispered circles. The ship swap theory persisted. The financial assassination theory evolved. Some even added a third hypothesis: the Titanic carried valuable cargo, including paintings, government documents, or even gold reserves. If certain assets needed to be erased, the depths of the Atlantic provided a permanent vault. These claims lack strong evidence, but form part of the broader mystery. The sinking of Titanic became more than a maritime disaster. It became a boundary where official history meets unresolved uncertainty. At its core lies a fundamental question: can coincidence alone explain every suspicious detail? By the time the last lifeboat rowed away from the sinking hull, the conspiracy, if real, had already succeeded. Those who stood to benefit survived. Those who stood in the way drowned in freezing darkness, their voices silenced, their influence erased. The powerful continued building the world according to their plans. Titanic's steel body rests in two broken halves at the ocean floor. Its story remains split the same way. One side is the version teachers recite, the other is the version critics investigate. Both exist. Only one can be the complete truth. Part 1 ends here, in uncertainty, after the ship has vanished beneath the surface, but before justice or revelation has risen above it. The dead remain. The unanswered questions remain with them. The RMS Titanic disappeared under the surface at approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. More than 1,500 lives were taken into the cold Atlantic. The official accounts concluded human error and a tragic encounter with an iceberg. But the aftermath, the investigations, and the decades that followed provided new points of suspicion. The disaster's consequences shaped finance, maritime laws, and public trust. Yet some argue the outcome also protected influential figures and concealed a deeper truth. In the first hours after the ship sank, chaos ruled the ocean. Lifeboats drifted in the darkness. The RMS Carpathia arrived around 4 a.m., responding to Titanic's last distress signals. It rescued the remaining survivors in boats. When daylight came, the sea was empty. No large debris. No visible evidence of the greatest ship ever built, only fragments and bodies floating in silence. Survivors were taken to New York. There, the narrative was managed. Public grief grew instantly. News spread with speed. Headlines described loss, heroism, and the final hours of the elite. But details from survivors began to conflict. Those who had been below decks spoke of confusion and blocked stairways. Some insisted the crew delayed announcements. Others said officers acted as if instructions were unclear. When interviewed, crew responses sounded practiced, as if they were following a script. Investigators noticed these patterns, but allowed them to pass into the record without confrontation. The United States Senate opened an inquiry led by Senator William Alden Smith. Britain formed its own Board of Trade investigation. These proceedings created the foundation of the accepted Titanic story. But both inquiries shared a critical flaw. The White Star Line and related financial interests had significant influence over testimonies and the final conclusions. Critics argue that the purpose was not truth, but reassurance. The world needed to believe industry leaders had learned from mistakes. Any implication of intentional wrongdoing threatened markets already shaken by the tragedy. One of the most controversial figures at the center of post-disaster scrutiny was J. Bruce Ismay. As managing director of White Star Line, he boarded a lifeboat and survived while so many others died. Newspapers condemned him as a coward. Survivors held mixed opinions. During testimony, he described chain-of-command decisions, but he evaded questions about safety policies and was shielded from deeper accusations. Some theorists claim that Ismay was protected because he knew too much. His role, if a conspiracy existed, required him alive, not silenced. J.P. Morgan remained distant. He offered condolences and financial aid to families, but avoided any implication that decisions surrounding Titanic's construction contributed to the disaster. When questioned why he canceled his voyage, he cited sudden illness. Later, journalists discovered he was seen in France with a mistress on the day Titanic sank. His health appeared unaffected. This contradiction fueled whispers. If he feared the voyage, was it because he knew the risk? Meanwhile, public arguments grew about whether Titanic was truly the ship that had sailed. Photographic comparisons became a centerpiece of early conspiracy theories. Researchers analyzed porthole placements along the hull. Some images suggested they matched earlier views of the Olympic. There were minor structural differences that should have been easy to document, but many construction records were incomplete or lost. The shipyard Harland and Wolff provided limited access to their archives. The company insisted the vessels were never switched. But to skeptics, refusal to provide proof equaled concealment. The debate over the ship swap intensified with discoveries from maritime historians decades later. They found luxury fittings and parts marked with identification numbers that aligned with Olympic's records rather than Titanic's. These included certain cabin panels and technical components. Though such parts might have been reused after repair cycles, the pattern raised suspicion. If Olympic remained in service after Titanic's sinking, why did some components circulate inconsistently between the two? The line between routine maintenance and intentional deception blurred. Financial motives remained central to the conspiracy arguments. White Star Line faced heavy repair costs for Olympic after its collision with HMS Hawke. Insurance did not cover all damage. Meanwhile, Titanic was new and fully insured. If Titanic sank, the company would receive payouts compensating far more than fixing Olympic. Critics suggest that a controlled sinking was planned near shipping lanes where help would be available. The ship would take on water slowly. All passengers would be evacuated. The loss would be financial, not human. But fate, or miscalculation, turned theory into catastrophe. The alleged presence of influential opponents to Morgan on Titanic became a major point in later conspiracy narratives. John Jacob Astor IV was a real estate magnate, inventor, and one of the richest men in the world. Benjamin Guggenheim controlled major mining interests. Isidor Straus co-owned Macy's department store and was a respected political figure. All three died in the sinking. Supporters of the conspiracy theory claim they opposed Morgan's push for U.S. central banking reform. Within 1 year of their deaths, the Federal Reserve Act passed. Morgan's circle gained power. The correlation cannot prove cause, but conspiracists argue that removing obstacles often precedes policy success. Critics counter that these men were wealthy but not unified politically. They argue the Federal Reserve Act resulted from decades of banking crisis and reform efforts. They see no evidence that targeting individuals would shape national finance. Yet, to those focused on elite influence, the coincidence remains suspicious. The Californian controversy became another puzzle piece. The SS Californian was the nearest ship during the sinking. Its crew saw rockets. Its wireless operator turned off the radio. Captain Lord dismissed the signals. Why did a ship positioned so close fail to respond? One theory suggests Californian was there as part of the original insurance plan. It would rescue passengers and complete the illusion of an accident. But when the collision damaged more compartments than anticipated, Titanic sank too quickly. The Californian's captain, now unprepared, hesitated. His reaction turned a staged event into a mass death. Official inquiries focused heavily on Californian, but theories insist this was an indirect admission of involvement. Over the years, Titanic mythology deepened. In 1985, when Robert Ballard located the wreck, it allowed physical comparison with historical ship designs. The breakup pattern, rivet compositions, and hull weaknesses were analyzed intensely. Some investigators found evidence of brittle steel and inferior rivets due to cost cutting. They argued that industry pressure caused systemic safety issues, not conspiracy. They viewed the story as a symbol of unchecked human pride, but others insisted the findings aligned with known damage on Olympic. The separation of the bow and stern suggested forces exceeding expectations, possibly linked to pre-existing structural fatigue. Another layer to the conspiracy narrative involves cargo. Titanic carried mail, machinery, and wealthy passengers' belongings. Some speculators believe the ship also held secret cargo. They claim certain documents or assets connected to financial or political reform needed to disappear. Records of cargo remain incomplete. Some manifests were altered or missing. This gap allowed theories to flourish. As decades passed, survivors aged and testimonies shifted. Memory became unreliable. Yet certain comments persisted. Some crew members claimed they had served on Olympic and noticed unexplained familiarity on board Titanic. One said he saw identification plates changed. Another described restricted areas during boarding. These claims lack verification, but contribute to public doubt. Every inconsistency became fuel. Institutions tried to maintain one version of history. Museums, documentaries, and popular films cemented the narrative of human tragedy. But investigations quietly continued. Shipyard workers came forward in later years, speaking anonymously. They described rushed instructions, secrecy around documentation, and pressure from corporate supervisors. They spoke too late for official review, but early enough to stir interest. Public fascination with Titanic expanded beyond historical curiosity. The story represented a convergence of power, tragedy, and unanswered questions. It suggested that the lives of ordinary people can be sacrificed for the ambitions of a few. Conspiracy believers argue that this theme appears repeatedly in history whenever wealth and influence are threatened. Opponents dismiss the theories as misunderstanding of maritime operations and exaggeration of coincidences. They cite Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually correct. The disaster was caused by human overconfidence, unsafe speed, and poor safety design. No secret motives, no grand plan. Yet simple explanations do not always satisfy those who look closely at who benefited. J.P. Morgan avoided the voyage, avoided accountability, and gained indirectly from the aftermath. Ismay survived and helped shape the narrative. Major opponents to Morgan's financial goals died on the ship. The White Star Line collected insurance, though not enough to profit, but enough to survive longer than expected. Each detail might be reasonable alone. Together, they form a pattern. Even the wreck today is protected. Expeditions require authorization. Many areas of the ship cannot be disturbed. Some argue this protects history. Others say it protects secrets. Without access to every part of the wreck and its components, definitive answers remain hidden in the deep. The story of Titanic exposes how history can be divided. One version becomes accepted fact, the other survives in the shadows. Researchers still examine archives, analyze photographs, and compare construction notes. Some pieces of the puzzle remain missing. As long as they do, alternative explanations retain power. In the end, understanding the Titanic conspiracy theories is not only about discovering whether the ship was switched or whether the sinking was planned. It is about examining how disaster benefits some and destroys others. It reveals how truth can be shaped by those who control information. More than 100 years have passed. Rust and pressure are slowly consuming the remains of Titanic. Eventually, the physical evidence will vanish. When that happens, The official story will remain untouched. The unanswered questions will remain unanswered forever. Conspiracy or tragedy, accident or design, the sinking of Titanic continues to challenge the trust people place in powerful systems. It reminds observers that public narratives can be incomplete, real motives can be concealed beneath national pride, media control, and legal authority. The Titanic is remembered as a symbol of human ambition defeated by nature. But another interpretation persists, that it was humanity defeated by greed. There are only two outcomes possible. Either one of history's greatest disasters was caused by a rare and terrible coincidence, or it was the result of calculated decisions by those who believed wealth could bend destiny. The truth lies somewhere between the surface and the ocean floor.